prior to the peak of the crisis, when it began to unfold, before that, we were pretty actively managing selective currency exposures on our balance sheet. And what I mean by selective are the ones that we controlled, we Treasury controlled, and they're the ones that we knew the most about. So, for example, we use a large volume of intercompany loan transactions in our organization, and since cash is typically moving in those scenarios, Treasury is involved from a cash standpoint, and so that enabled us to get our hands around the exposures that those would generate, and we'd be informed as to when they would change. Pretty straightforward. However, given we do operate in a large number of countries, we're a very company code intensive organization, well over 300 legal entities, and we're mainly local currency functional. Suffice to say that there's a lot of nooks and crannies on our balance sheet where exposures could hide, and we weren't necessarily in tune with all of those. As the market really began to become more volatile, and of course everybody's aware of what happened with the U.S. dollar, anywhere where we would have had U.S. dollar denominated assets or liabilities, for that matter, anywhere on our balance sheet would have started to generate some P&L volatility that we may not have anticipated coming through. So once we started to experience this a couple years ago, we set out on an initiative and really set out 4 main objectives. And I guess you could really view these objectives as achievements as well, because I think we pretty well ticked the boxes on each one of these. The first was to take a solution like FiREapps and really do a much better job of identifying and summarizing and categorizing all of the exposures across our multitude of company codes across the enterprise. We do have a single instance of SAP, so that was a good starting point, obviously, from an efficiency point of view. But again, we really have there's a high volume of account data, a high volume of company codes with accounts that we measure, and so just getting our arms around that was the first thing. The second thing was to be able to identify that data and then really divorce ourselves from the accounting cycle. Our organization, just like most others, we're very tied to monthly accounting cycles, quarterly close cycles, and that's really the way that I think we used to think about exposures. That really doesn't solve the issue anymore, because in a matter of days you can have several digit movements of currency against each other. And so we really wanted to think about an entry's made on the 7th of the month that creates an exposure. Well, let's start managing it on the 7th of the month. The third thing was, once we were able to identify the data, think more about real time, that also gave us the opportunity to really rationalize how we hedged exposures, making no hedge decisions, thinking about maybe hedging for different periods of time, different maturities, using the data that's in front of us to actually say, is hedging on a month-to-month basis really the right thing to do? And that was something that we were able to do once we had our arms around the data. And then lastly, we also triggered a very large internal transformation effort around all of our IT environment from a finance point of view. But the effort to really look at foreign exchange exposure differently gave us a springboard to really get our local finance teams, get our local entity controllers, our tax people really thinking about the fact that anybody who has the ability to make a journal entry in our organization, and it's a large number of people, can have an impact on creating FX exposure. And so things like clearing accounts on time, making entries into the accounting system on the value dates that the transactions are actually meant to be recorded, all of those things help. And the effort that we undertook with our internal organization was really putting the cap on the overall effort. Again, given the size of our organization, we could have come at this slightly differently. All the policies and procedures in the world, send me an email when you make this entry so that I can make sure I manage it, type concepts just really wouldn't work in our environment. And so, one of the things that we found was a fairly high priority was to really base, our improvements on a sort of an industrialized or technology-based solution as opposed to relying on human procedural types of approaches would kind of be the one thing. And I know I touched on the volume issue before, but I think the other aspect of the analytics, one of the things we're able to do is we can actually look at this pretty much any day we want. Now, there are certain days of the month where it may not make sense because the close isn't done and there's maybe some balances haven't been updated. But throughout the balance of the month, we can actually, if we have any questions or concerns, we're in a position where we can take a snapshot and really, as I mentioned before, sort of separate ourselves from the monthly cycles. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that we would have never known had we not had an ability to look at things at a portfolio level by currency pair. It's one thing if you've got a euro entity that's got a Swiss franc exposure, not knowing that you've got a Swiss franc functional entity that has a euro exposure that's going exactly the opposite direction, let's say of almost identical size and shape and sort of characteristics. So by looking at things kind of at a total picture, we've been able to slow down a little bit and say, well, I'm not just going to hedge every individual transaction. We're going to hedge everything to its fullest for the period of time that makes the most sense, because P&L volatility reduction is our highest priority with regard to this particular program. But at the same time, it allowed us to sort of step back and say, well, hold on, if I've got some natural offset here because the product, the tools are telling me I've got some things I wasn't aware of. That we didn't eliminate a lot of exposures, but we were able to net a lot of them. Culturally, it may seem counterintuitive because we're a technology company, but from an internal point of view, like our culture is, we like to use solutions off the shelf. We don't like to generally do a lot of customization. Having been an SAP shop for many, many years, one of the things we've systematically done over time as we've put more and more through that ERP solution, we've been steadily decommissioning all sorts of homegrown applications that needed all kinds of customized support. Could we have built this or a solution that would have given us some insights and fully customized it? The capability may have been there, certainly not within our treasury function, but within our IT organization. But at the same time, it just made sense for us. Time to production was a priority, not having to build something that we then have to support. And ultimately, I would prefer to have, deep SAP skills where they belong in the IT organization rather than have them in my treasury shop. When we were having some P&L surprises due to FX, we implemented the solution to solve that. But what we were then identifying was, well, first thing it showed us is we're not using SAP the way that we're supposed to as an organization, because I don't know what I don't know. And if we're not using it real time, FiREapps will show that to you. So then what we were able to do is leverage that and say, hey, this was a CFO priority, guys, and when I can't see what I need to see, we need to fix that, need to correct that. So as part of an overall framework of sort of retooling how our treasury function works, both from a cash and an FX perspective, we engaged, I don't want to downplay the amount of effort here. There was many workshops. There was lots of calls, lots of telepresence, really going through procedural-based, discussions about how certain transactions and cycles of transactions should work and who's accountable for things like clearing this clearing account instead of clearing that clearing account. I mean, it literally gets down into that sort of nuts and bolts discussion. But at the end of the day, like I said, we're never there 100%, but we do have a much, much better appreciation across many, many management nodes and finance nodes where, journal entries can have a major FX impact.